Welcome to the latest edition of GrowthChat. Today, we are very happy to have Elias Papaioannou, Professor of Economics at London Business School with us. Hi, Elias. Welcome.
Hi, Sascha. Hi, Marco. Thanks for your kind invitation.
So we will be talking about a paper that Elias wrote with Stelios Michalopoulos on pre-colonial ethnic institutions and contemporary African development. And maybe to get us going, Elias, you could tell us a bit about the historical background of the paper.
Sure. So we started working with Stelios on Africa now 12 years ago, 13 years ago, while I was at Dartmouth College and he was at Tufts. And initially, we wanted to explore the role of national institutions. So, for example, rule of law, efficient bureaucracy, independent judiciary, absence of graft on economic development. And we thought at the time that Africa offers a nice setting to study the role of national institutions because you have many ethnicities, people from the same ethnic and cultural and linguistic background, that because of the quasi-random design of African borders that happened well before independence, when actually Europeans who designed the borders couldn't foresee African independence, offered us an experiment like many sources of experimental variation because roughly speaking, the geography, let's say, of the Maasai split between Kenya and Tanzania is the same. Roughly speaking, their customs and traditions are the same, but they were subject to different colonial institutions and perhaps post-independence national institutions. So one of the challenges we had to deal at the time was, first of all, how to measure the ethnic landscape. And there we drew on research, actually some earlier research, but among others by Nathan Nunn, who had used anthropological information from George Peter Murdoch, who has delineated the ancestral ethnic homelands of various ethnic groups in Africa. Clearly not perfect, but it was a pretty decent effort. And then we had to match this with some proxy of regional development because we wanted to measure development, let's say, at the homeland of the Zulu or the Tswana or the Maasai or the Ewe across. And then we came with this idea that we can use satellite imagery on light density at night, like, those photos of Earth that we typically see in magazines or when we fly. These are available from the National Oceanographic Agency and NASA, actually quite granular level of analysis. So then when we conducted our analysis, so we associated differences at the border of national institutions with differences in regional development as proxied by luminosity. To our surprise, because at the time we were coming from economics, we found no statistical association. In some places, you had higher levels of development, actually, in the part of the border with low quality institutions, rather than the place with high levels of institutions. So I don't want to go much into the details of that paper that we published with Stelios, but then this negative result, we explored it a lot and it continued to be negative. But it pushed us to think, if institutions do not matter, national institutions like the one we tend to think in Australia, when we think about Germany, when we think about Greece, when we think about Peru, what then? So actually, this was extremely intellectually stimulating because it pushed us to read. It pushed us to talk with people who had worked, not in economics, but coming from African historiography and policy science. And they all pointed out to the salience of ethnic institutions and ethnic norms. Institutions here, perhaps could be formal, could be informal, or some hybrid of the two. And there were very good reasons why ethnic institutions still matter in Africa. First of all, the colonizers, as you know, established small communities in Africa, mostly in the coastline. So it's not that there was significant penetration inland. And actually, in some cases, the doctrine of indirect rule or native rule, as was coined at the time, actually suggested that the ethnic chiefs had a pronounced role during colonization. Actually, in some cases, like for example, in Sierra Leone, the British actually appointed their own chiefs because they didn't find politically centralized ethnic groups there. And there is very exciting work among others by Mohammed Mamdani, who argues that, look, then independence happens, the power is those ethnic leaders, ethnic chiefs, it's at the ethnicity level or the linguistic level, and typically Europeans with indirect rule and divide and rule actually magnified those differences that were not that salient to start with. So therefore, look at ethnic norms, look at ethnic features. So then, inspired by work in economics on state capacity and centralization that at the time was at its infancy, but it was already having a splash, we decided to look on, the degree of political centralization of ethnic groups just before the arrival of Europeans, roughly speaking, 1880, 1890. And we were actually quite privileged that George Peter Murdoch and his collaborators had compiled some proxies of the complexity of political institutions in Africa at that time and how hierarchically structured they were. And this was actually quite important because actually scholars, for example, like Jared Diamond, not to say African scholars like John Van Sina and Fortes and Evan Pritchard, had long argued that, look, in Africa, as elsewhere, you can find two extreme sets of political organizations. Kingdoms with a structure that they collect taxes, they provide some public goods, they have some, obviously, class stratification, there is wealth inequality, where perhaps there is some money in circulation, there is some economic activity that is governed by this kingdom. And then at the other extreme, you had so-called acephalous or fragmented, I don't like either of the word, societies, where that they are organized at the village level. They may have some local elders or some chiefs that help them deal with some risk sharing or social issues at the community level, but they are not that much politically organized. And of course, one could add some hybrids, some chiefdoms or some large chiefdoms, where you had some alliance or some degree of complexity. And actually, quite importantly, African scholars that we read actually made the point that Africa was quote unquote a bit unfortunate because colonization hit at the time when you had this process that happened in Europe, happened elsewhere, where those societies were becoming more and more like small chiefdoms, larger chiefdoms, and over time they were being developed as more and more centralized chiefdoms with bureaucracies. So then what we did is we combined actually the anthropological information on the spatial distribution of ethnic groups. We distinguished which groups are politically centralized, large or petty chiefdoms, and more, if you like, organization at the local level. And we associated that with regional development that we approximated using light density at night, because at the time, at least, there were no data available reflecting welfare or income or any proxy of economic development at the local level. And in sharp contrast to our non-significance between national institutions and regional development, actually we found a very strong correlation between pre-colonial political organization and contemporary development. So this long run, if you like, correlation, which suggests that, in those places in African countries, within countries, so we compare different parts, let's say, of Nigeria or different parts of Uganda, for example, the Banionkele, a strong kingdom with the Akoli that was organized not as a chiefdom. And we find that actually this very simple and clearly noisy measure that Murdoch produced actually correlates very strongly. It explains a non-negligible part of regional development within countries, which, as we have shown also with Stelios and Alberto Alesina and Sebastian Homan in more recent research, is characterized by vast regional inequalities. So we could explain part of this, regional divergence, if you like, or difference in well-being, let's say within Nigeria or within Uganda or within Ghana.
Oh, amazing. Yeah. No, go ahead.
Yeah, so then our second step was to try to say something more about this long-run correlation. Now, the job there, it was far from easy in the sense that, at least at the time, and still there is not much research, unfortunately, about pre-colonial or early colonial features in the continent. For example, we know a lot, the world knows a lot about, what happened in ancient Athens. We know a lot what happened in medieval Germany or before that. Sadly, we do not know enough. Not what happened in the ancient times in Zimbabwe, but not what was happening, let's say, in 17th century or 16th century. However, what we try to get around this issue, Murdoch we did two tests effectively. One, Murdoch provides information not only about the political organization of those ethnic groups, but also about their economic structure. So whether they were doing agriculture, whether they were doing fishing, whether they were pastoralists. It also provides some information on how urbanized or densely located the population was, which we know from important work in economics that it correlates in pre-industrial societies with well-being, plus some other measures of, social issues. And what we found is that, look, we ran many correlations, long-run correlations. We had that, look, only political centralization correlates with contemporary development. So while, it's not a bullet-proof result, is that it seems that it is political organization rather than something else that perhaps correlates with political centralization. And then the second thing we did to advance on the causal interpretation of the results, which again, it was our effort at the time, was to go to within countries, find nearby ethnic groups, nearby as identified with Murdoch back 150 years ago, and then compare nearby groups where the one was politically centralized and the other one was not politically centralized. The intellectual basis from that actually comes from an anthropologist, Mary Douglas, who compared in Congo two groups, doing an anthropological study. And of course, it's very similar to what economists now do, like spatial regression discontinuity designs, where you compare, two nearby places where the one receives some treatment and the other one did not. And despite obvious measurement error, not only drawing error, but the fact that, ethnic groups interact, of course, we also found that, look, we do see higher levels of economic activity today, as reflected in luminosity, in the homeland, in the ancestral homeland of the politically centralized groups, which further, advanced this idea that, perhaps there is a link between political centralization in the past and contemporary development. We didn't do much more, so I think now future work, not only working in Africa, but elsewhere, is looking, what are exactly the mechanisms? Is it, for example, because centralized groups have an efficient bureaucracy? Is it because there is a lot of risk sharing happening? And, African states are not particularly efficient, so risk sharing in Africa happens not at the national level, for example, as it happens in Germany, but happens more at the local level. Is it because of better public goods provision and some form, let's say, of policing? This is an open area of research. We are having some work with Stelios, but other scholars are doing very important work examining those differences, for example, in Vietnam, Melissa Dell and co-authors, or in various other centers. So let me pause here.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. What is most surprising about your result for many readers, I would guess, is the fact that, well, we have colonialism, and you would think that the colonizers make tabula rasa, and all these pre-existing differences are gone after several decades of colonialism. But you find that the pre-colonial institutions persist, and you touched on it a little bit, but maybe you can elaborate a bit more on why it is that this survives colonialism.
That's a great question, and again, it's not necessarily we show this in the paper, but let me tell you what we wrote. We read about it, and doing some field work, it seems to be there. First of all, colonization in Africa is much short-lived, much less than Latin America, for example, or India or elsewhere. So effectively colonization, setting aside North Africa and perhaps South Africa, the country, starts roughly speaking 1870, 1880, and by the end of Second World War is completed. And then officially it ends with the wave of independence in the 60s mostly. So it's short-lived. Second, Europeans established very small communities in Africa. So you didn't have like the mass migration that happened, for example, in Australia, or you don't have the somewhat medium-sized communities that were established in Latin America and the Caribbean. So there are small communities, mostly in the coastline. So it's not, and actually the Europeans who penetrated England were mostly missionaries and some extremely adventurous individuals seeking mostly ivory. So colonizers were short-lived, mostly in the coastline, not much interior. Second, actually Europeans, and this is the point of Mamdani, actually reinforced the salience of ethnic institutions because they decided to implement indirect rule. For example, the north of Nigeria was continuing being ruled by the kingdoms that already existed at the time. And actually there is some evidence, for example, in Nigeria that actually their salience increased during that time. So this is the second. Third, Europeans, and actually Rwanda is a sad example of that, quite often drew ethnic lines. So ethnic lines were not, particularly there, at least in many countries. There was a lot of mingling, of intermarriage, a lot of interrelations. But then Europeans, in their strategy of indirect rule, typically they would appoint one group that, at the time they thought A, to rule B and C. Let me just say that also at the time, neither the administrators knew much. And there was also an inherent racism at the time. So these three main reasons explain why those ethnic norms and institutions, formal and informal, persisted. And then sadly, although some African countries actually tried to bring national identity and bring down ethnic identification, the role of chief, for example, the Julius Nyerere paradigm in Tanzania, Zamora Marcel in Mozambique tried to do something similar. In most countries, actually, for example, Uganda, the ethnic identification, ethnic groups are even, legal, or in Ghana, in parts of Ghana. So ethnicity remained actually silent, and because of the weak state capacity of the modern African states, actually, this legacy persisted. And this, for example, could be one explanation why we see this lasting legacy.
Thank you, Elias.
Thank you, Elias. I have just a quick question. I mean, you explain everything in your presentation here. You already talked about the data and how you guys collected the data. So what do you find challenging in this line of research? So this is like the intersection between culture and political economy and history. So what did you find challenging? What do you find exciting?
Well, let me say that actually, following also Sascha's important work, and with Stelios and also then subsequently with Alberto and Sebastian, for us the challenge was very interesting and we love doing it. So in the sense that, clearly it's not that, the IMF or the World Bank or, the Penwell tables will publish like a statistics on pre-colonial centralization or how intense or extractive or colonization was. But actually, and I think this is a lesson for economics going forward, there's important research outside economics. And, for example, Murdoch, an anthropologist and ethnographer, tried to compile some quote unquote quantitative measures. I understand that many of my colleagues in economics and many anthropologists, are not particularly happy or, they point to some mistakes or noise. Let's try to make it better. So for us, it was actually quite illuminating that we're part of a group of researchers that tried to bring together the tools of economics together with data that would come from satellites, with some historical data or ethnographic data. So clearly it was at the time at least non-mainstream, but it was actually quite interesting, to spend time and read, reading, for example, Jan Van Sina is, I would say, more interesting than reading the IMF country report for Greece.
Talking about Greece, I mean, you are Greek origin. So what made you do research on Africa?
Okay, so first of all, I was always interested in history. So it started from my love for history. Secondly, initially, our interest on Africa came, as I explained earlier, from our thought that we have many, let's say, North and South Koreas, where people of the same ethnic, religious, cultural background were subject to very different institutions. So it was, I would say, somewhat random or, a coincidence. But actually, when we started going, it was extremely interesting for us to keep reading about this beautiful place. Since then, also again with Stelios and Giorgio Chiovelli, we have worked in Mozambique. We have a project assessing the impact of landmines, and now a project with Sandra Sequeira on the civil war and displacement. So the more we learned, the more interested I became, and my friends at the same time. So, the more you read, plus I came to realize, because when we started working on Africa, the crisis hadn't hit Greece yet. It was just in the beginning of the crisis in the European periphery. But actually, many of the issues that are relevant, let's say for an average, a typical African country, are not that dissimilar from the challenges that, developed countries or high-income countries like Greece, for example, face. Perhaps they're not to that extent, but they're still relevant. Second, I think the key insight, and Sascha, you have done important work there, understanding the role of history and important historical legacies on development. And I would say development, not only GDP, how people behave, social development, or, how people think about how they vote, how they participate in public affairs, political modernization, actually are fascinating issues. But of course, we work mostly in Africa, but, others, focus on Europe, on France, on Vietnam. Now with Stelios, we're working in Greece and the population exchange that happened in the early 1920s. So I think there are many lessons from this interesting approach.
Absolutely. So did you always want to become an economist or a social scientist, or did you have other plans while in high school?
Well, it was, in my case, at least totally out of plan. I did law as an undergrad in Athens. I was not particularly keen in pursuing a legal scholar career, nor a lawyer, as my father was and still is. So then I decided to switch to economics. I was always interested in politics, and economics, of course, is a core component of politics. So I switched to Columbia University and I did a master's in public administration, but actually from the very early on, I decided to follow as closely as possible the PhD in economics curriculum at Columbia. And then I liked statistics and econometrics and also economic theory and modeling, and then decided to do a PhD. Actually, at the time when I decided to do a PhD, I always thought, and that's why I went to the London Business School, I thought that then I would switch to the industry, perhaps, do banking or consulting. But then as I was doing more and more research, I was, I liked it. So, I think that people should do what they like. So in a nutshell, it was something of a coincidence.
Yeah. You also mentioned, as we introduced ourselves before the interview, that you also teach cultural economics to MBA students. And some people might think, wow, that's unusual in a business school, but can you tell us a bit more what you like about it and what the students like about it?
Well, as you rightly said, I just finished lecturing actually a course called Ethics at the London Business School, which is mandatory course for the incoming MBA class. It is being taught by 5 different faculty, each coming from a different subject area. So someone coming from strategy, someone coming from accounting, someone coming from OB, so from applied psychology, me, and someone coming from operations research. And actually, I think that in business and business education, we observe something similar to what we see in economics research. And of course, the two are related. In economics research, 20 years ago, when I did my grad studies, there was very little discussion about culture, perhaps a bit more about institutions, and the way actually we were thinking about growth was perhaps through the Solo or the Rommel model in some quote-unquote technical manner, industrialization or investments in human capital and how these things lead to growth. Obviously, that's a right way to move forward. Nonetheless, I remember when I teach the Solo model, savings is exogenous. So then there's a straightforward question, why on earth, people in Asia save much more than, let's say, people in South Europe. So even this model that doesn't have to say anything about culture, effectively, it has you need, all students will tell you, okay, where is savings coming from? Well, in the Ramsey model, we endogenize savings, which in a very nice way, actually, but still, it must be the case. I mean, this is what most of the students and my friends say, is that it has to have some either cultural component or more institutional component. So nowadays, it is becoming much more mainstream to think about the formal rules of the game, to use Douglas North's phrase, both formal institutions and informal culture. And I think in business, it's the same thing. For example, in most of the leading business schools, I can for sure say for LBS, more and more students want to learn about ethics They are taking more and more courses in organizational behavior, which applied psychology and to some extent sociology. So they want to learn about the organizations. It is now clear, even to my colleagues in strategy, that organizations have also their own culture. The way we tend to think that, people from different countries or from different regions or from different ethnic groups have different culture. Organizations tend to have different culture. And actually, the more I talk with alumni of the school, and they are all like CEOs or top executives, they keep saying that, they lose most of the time in trying to steer organizations and navigate the corporate culture. Besides, nowadays, and we see a lot here at the London Business School students, they all care about social issues, environment, for example, justice, many other issues, which were not the case clearly 20 years ago or when I completed my grad studies. And they want to learn more because they see their view not necessarily or exclusively as the CEO of company X trying to maximize, the value of the pie, as we used to say in corporate finance, but also to have like a good meaning of their life, to do good on the societies. And I think there is, these change of mindset who have progressed in business from the famous Friedman doctrine that CEOs should only care about shareholder maximization. And I think that this, it speaks, this business perspective does speak with our own research and many others of the need to understand the culture of people, to understand, how communities differ with a degree of trust, for example, and why some societies design quote unquote efficient institutions and some others not. So I don't find it inconsistent. Actually, I was trying to explain to the students that actually the two move, there's a dialogue, if you like, between the two.
Yeah, I fully agree. No, fantastic. Elias, thank you so much. It was a true pleasure to see you again after a long time and to have this interview with you. And I hope to see you face to face again in the near future. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you, Sascha.
Thank you, Elias.
Thank you, Marco.
Thanks, Sascha, for running the interview. I'll see you at the next one.